On the morning of February 1st, 1943, a 28-year-old Army Signal Corps lieutenant named Meredith Gardner sat at a wooden desk in a cramped office in Arlington Hall Station, a former girls' school in Arlington, Virginia, that had been converted into a signals intelligence facility 9 months earlier. The room had no windows, only a single overhead light fixture that cast harsh shadows across the stacks of paper covering his workspace. Gardner, who had received his doctorate in German linguistics from the University of Wisconsin 3 years before being drafted, was surrounded by thousands of pages of encrypted Soviet diplomatic cables, long columns of seemingly random 5-digit number groups that represented messages transmitted between Moscow and Soviet diplomatic missions in the United States. His assignment that morning was the same as it had been every morning since his transfer to Arlington Hall in October 1942, to find patterns in randomness, to discover structure in chaos, to break codes that Soviet cryptographers believed were mathematically unbreakable. Gardner did not know, as he began his work that February morning, that he was about to initiate what would become one of the most significant counterintelligence operations in American history, a project that would eventually be codenamed Venona, though that name would not be assigned until years later. He did not know that the work he was beginning would continue for more than 4 decades, involving hundreds of cryptanalysts, mathematicians, and intelligence officers. He did not know that the messages he would eventually decrypt would expose Soviet espionage networks operating throughout the United States government, defense industries, and scientific establishments. And he certainly did not know that among the thousands of encrypted communications he was examining were messages that would lead directly to arrests, imprisonments, and the destruction of families whose members had never committed any crime beyond being related to people who had. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about how a mathematical breakthrough that changed the course of counterintelligence destroyed families who never knew they were being watched. The cables Gardner was examining had been collected through a signals intelligence operation that predated America's entry into World War II. Beginning in 1939, the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service, working with commercial telegraph companies under legal authorities that would later become controversial, had begun making copies of all international telegrams transmitted to and from the United States. This collection was initially focused on diplomatic communications from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but it also included messages sent between the Soviet Union and its diplomatic missions in New York, Washington, San Francisco, and other American cities. These Soviet messages arrived as long sequences of 5-digit number groups: 4, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 1, 8, 2, 9, 0, 3, 8, 4, 5, 9, 2, 7, 3, 6, transmitted in what was known as a one-time pad cipher, a method of encryption that Soviet cryptographers and their counterparts in Western intelligence agencies all considered to be absolutely secure when properly implemented. The mathematics of one-time pad encryption were straightforward and, in theory, unbreakable. Each message was encoded using a truly random key used only once and then destroyed. The sender would convert text into numbers using a code book, combine these with random key numbers using modular addition, and transmit the result. The recipient would reverse the process with an identical key. Because each key was random and used once, there was no pattern to exploit. Without the key, the encrypted message could theoretically represent any text of the same length. Soviet intelligence services had used this system for decades with absolute confidence in its security. What Gardner and his colleagues at Arlington Hall did not yet know in early 1943 was that the Soviet one-time pad system had a catastrophic vulnerability, not in the mathematics of the encryption algorithm itself, but in how the keys had been generated and distributed during a specific period in the early 1940s. Meredith Gardner was not the first cryptanalyst assigned to work on Soviet diplomatic traffic. That distinction belonged to Colonel William F. Friedman, who had founded the Army's Signal Intelligence Service in 1930 and who was widely considered to be one of the world's foremost experts in cryptanalysis. Friedman had examined Soviet encrypted messages in the late 1930s and had concluded that the one-time pad system, if properly implemented, was indeed unbreakable. He had advised his superiors that resources would be better spent on German and Japanese codes, which used more complex but ultimately vulnerable encryption systems. This assessment had been accepted, and Soviet messages had been filed away in storage without serious cryptanalytic effort for several years. The decision to revisit Soviet communications in 1943 came from a shift in strategic priorities. Although the Soviet Union was nominally an American ally against Nazi Germany, there were deep suspicions within the U.S. military and intelligence establishments about Soviet intentions. Reports had reached American officials suggesting that Soviet intelligence services were running extensive espionage operations inside the United States, particularly focused on obtaining information about atomic research, which by 1943 had become the Manhattan Project. The fear was that while the United States was sharing substantial military and economic aid with the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, Soviet intelligence might be stealing American military secrets that would be used against American interests after the war. In January 1943, the decision was made to establish a dedicated effort to analyze Soviet communications. Gardner was one of several linguists and cryptanalysts assigned to this new project. The work was extraordinarily tedious. Gardner and his colleagues had no computers, no mechanical calculating devices beyond basic adding machines, and no way to process the volume of data except through manual examination. They began by organizing the messages chronologically and by diplomatic mission, looking for any regularities that might suggest vulnerability. For months, the work produced nothing. The messages appeared to be exactly what Soviet cryptographers intended them to be, random sequences of numbers without any discernible pattern. Gardner's breakthrough came not from mathematical analysis, but from linguistic intuition. In August 1943, examining a series of messages sent from the Soviet consulate in New York to Moscow in 1942, Gardner noticed something anomalous. Several messages had sections where certain 5-digit groups appeared more frequently than probability would suggest in truly random sequences. The statistical deviation was minor, something that might easily be dismissed as coincidence. But his training had taught him to pay attention to small irregularities. He began comparing these messages in detail, looking for any relationship between them. What Gardner discovered was that portions of different messages appeared to have been encrypted using the same key material, a violation of the fundamental principle of one-time pad security. If two messages were encrypted with the same key, it was theoretically possible to exploit this reuse to begin breaking the code. The process was called depth analysis, and it worked by comparing messages encrypted with identical keys to identify patterns that would reveal the underlying plaintext. If the cryptanalyst could determine what one word or phrase was, that information could be used to decode the same position in another message encrypted with the same key. Each piece of recovered plaintext made it easier to recover additional plaintext in a cascading process that could eventually expose entire messages. Gardner's discovery raised immediate questions. If the Soviets were reusing keys, It meant either that they had made catastrophic errors in key distribution, unlikely for an intelligence service known for operational security, or that something had happened to force them to reuse keys despite understanding the security implications. Gardner and his supervisors at Arlington Hall began investigating the history of Soviet key production and distribution. Through signals intelligence, and later through information from defectors and captured German intelligence documents, they eventually pieced together what had happened. In June 1941, Nazi Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, its massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The German advance had been swift and devastating, overrunning huge portions of Soviet territory in the war's opening months. Among the casualties of the German invasion was the Soviet logistics system for producing and distributing one-time pads. The facilities that manufactured key materials were either destroyed or evacuated eastward ahead of the German advance. Soviet intelligence services operating in the United States and other countries found themselves running short of new keys while simultaneously facing increased demands for communications with Moscow. Rather than allow communications to stop, Soviet cryptographers made a decision that they believed represented an acceptable risk. They reused portions of old keys, distributing them to different field stations with the expectation that messages sent from different locations at different times would not be intercepted and compared by adversaries. This decision would prove to be catastrophic. The Americans were intercepting all Soviet diplomatic traffic, and Gardner now had the analytical tool to begin breaking it. The process of exploiting the key reuse was agonizingly slow. Gardner could not simply feed numbers into a machine and produce decrypted text. Each message had to be manually compared with other messages suspected of sharing key material. Each potential word or phrase had to be tested against the structure of the codebook the Soviets were using. Each success provided slightly more information that could be used to attack additional messages. Gardner worked with Cecil Phillips, another cryptanalyst at Arlington Hall, who had expertise in Russian language, and with other specialists in statistics and communications security. Together, over months of effort, they began to recover fragments of text from Soviet messages transmitted in 1942 and 1943. The first messages they partially decrypted appeared to be routine diplomatic traffic, discussions of political issues, requests for supplies, bureaucratic communications between Moscow and its foreign missions. But as Gardner and Phillips made progress on additional messages, patterns began to emerge that indicated something far more significant. Certain messages contained language that did not fit diplomatic communications. They referenced materials, contacts, recruitment, and information in ways that suggested intelligence operations. They used cover names, pseudonyms that concealed the real identities of people being discussed. They described meetings, dead drops, payment arrangements, and operational security procedures. By late 1944, Gardner and Phillips had accumulated enough decrypted material to reach a definitive conclusion. They were reading communications from Soviet intelligence officers to their headquarters in Moscow, describing espionage operations inside the United States. The breakthrough that transformed the project from an interesting counterintelligence discovery into a matter of urgent national security came on December 20th, 1946. On that date, Gardner was working on a message sent from the Soviet consulate in New York to Moscow on August 9th, 1944. The message had been partially decrypted over previous months, but significant portions remained unreadable. On December 20th, Gardner succeeded in recovering passages that made clear he was reading about American intelligence assets providing information to Soviet handlers, including references to atomic espionage. Gardner reported this finding to his superiors at Arlington Hall, who immediately forwarded it to the FBI. The Bureau's Counterintelligence Division began the process of trying to identify specific individuals based on the fragmentary biographical details contained in the decrypted messages. The task was extraordinarily difficult. The FBI had hundreds of Soviet messages that mentioned cover names and operational details, but translating those cover names into real identities required additional information. Biographical details, professional associations, patterns of activity that could be cross-referenced with what was known about people who had access to information the Soviets would want. The investigation led the FBI to begin systematic reviews of Americans who had been members of the Communist Party or who had associations with Soviet front organizations in the late 1930s and early 1940s. The process was complex and slow, requiring investigators to compare sparse details from decoded messages with vast databases of personnel files, security clearance applications, and counterintelligence records. The work eventually led to the identification of multiple Soviet intelligence networks. The most famous case arising from Venona decryptions was that of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Venona messages revealed that Julius Rosenberg, an electrical engineer who had worked for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, had been involved in Soviet atomic espionage. The Rosenbergs were arrested in 1950 and executed in 1953 for conspiracy to commit espionage. The Venona evidence that had led to their identification was never disclosed to the defense or mentioned in court, a decision made at the highest levels of government to protect the continuing effort to decrypt Soviet messages. This secrecy would later fuel decades of debate about whether the Rosenbergs had received a fair trial, but the Rosenberg case, though it received the most public attention, was only one of dozens of investigations that grew from Gardner's cryptanalytic work. The Venona decryptions revealed Soviet intelligence sources in the State Department, including Alger Hiss, a senior official who was convicted of perjury in 1950. They revealed sources in the Treasury Department, including Harry Dexter White, a senior economist who helped design the post-war international financial system and who died in 1948 before he could be prosecuted. They revealed sources in the Manhattan Project itself, including physicist Klaus Fuchs and technician David Greenglass, brother of Ethel Rosenberg. They revealed sources in the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that was the predecessor to the CIA. The pattern that emerged from these cases was consistent and devastating. Soviet intelligence had successfully recruited Americans based on ideological sympathy with communism, offering them opportunities to help the Soviet Union while portraying espionage as a form of political activism rather than as treason. Many of these individuals were young, idealistic, and convinced that they were contributing to a more just world. They believed they were helping an ally against fascism. They rationalized that the information they were providing was not truly sensitive. They failed to anticipate the consequences of their choices, and in every case, the consequences extended far beyond the individuals who committed espionage. The Venona decryptions identified people, the FBI arrested them, prosecutors charged them, juries convicted them, and judges sentenced them to prison. But the real punishment fell on families who had committed no crime, wives who learned their husbands had been living double lives, children who lost parents to prison, siblings who faced social stigma and ostracism for being related to spies. The case of the Rosenberg children illustrates the pattern. Michael and Robert Rosenberg were 10 and 6 years old when their parents were arrested in 1950. They were 13 and 9 when their parents were executed in 1953. They were raised by relatives who eventually adopted them and changed their surnames to Shield. They grew up knowing that their parents had been executed as Soviet spies, struggling with questions of identity, loyalty, and whether their parents had been guilty or victims of political persecution. For decades, they maintained their parents' innocence, based not on knowledge of the facts, but on the impossibility of believing that loving parents could have committed treason. Only after the Venona decryptions were declassified in 1995 did they acknowledge that their father had been guilty, though they continued to believe their mother had been unjustly executed. The case of David Greenglass, who testified against his sister Ethel Rosenberg, illustrates another pattern. Greenglass, a machinist who had worked at Los Alamos on the Manhattan Project, confessed to passing atomic secrets to Soviet intelligence through his brother-in-law Julius Rosenberg. He agreed to testify against Julius and Ethel in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case and contributed to both Rosenberg's convictions and death sentences. Greenglass served 10 years in prison and was released in 1960. He lived under an assumed name for the rest of his life, estranged from his surviving family members, carrying the burden of having testified against his sister. In interviews decades later, he expressed regret for his role in her execution, acknowledging that he had lied about some details of her involvement to protect his own wife from prosecution. The case of Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project and who was identified through Venona as having passed atomic secrets to Soviet intelligence, illustrates the international dimensions of Soviet espionage. Fuchs was arrested in Britain in 1950, confessed, and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. He served 9 years and was released in 1959, after which he moved to East Germany and continued his scientific career. Fuchs never expressed remorse for his espionage, maintaining throughout his life that he had been motivated by political conviction and belief that nuclear secrets should be shared to prevent American monopoly on atomic weapons. His case raised questions about scientific ethics, international cooperation, and the responsibilities of scientists working on weapons of mass destruction. These cases, the Rosenbergs, Greenglass, Fuchs, Hiss, White, and dozens of others, represented the human face of the Venona Project. They were the individuals whose lives were destroyed or fundamentally altered because Meredith Gardner had noticed statistical anomalies in encrypted Soviet messages and had spent years painstakingly reconstructing plaintext from fragments of recovered code. The broader impact of the Venona Project extended far beyond individual prosecutions. Between 1943 and 1980, when the project was finally shut down, American and British cryptanalysts succeeded in at least partially decrypting approximately 3,000 messages out of more than 1 million encrypted Soviet communications that had been intercepted. These decryptions identified approximately 349 Americans who had some form of relationship with Soviet intelligence services during the 1930s and 1940s. Of these, not all were actual spies. Some were individuals who had been assessed for recruitment but never actually provided information, while others had provided information they believed was innocuous or had been manipulated without their knowledge. The decryptions led to dozens of espionage investigations and prosecutions. Some individuals were convicted and imprisoned, others were quietly removed from sensitive positions without public disclosure. Still others were investigated but never charged, either because evidence was insufficient or because the Venona materials could not be used in court without revealing the project's existence. The decision to keep Venona classified meant that many espionage suspects were never prosecuted, while others were prosecuted using evidence that appeared circumstantial because the definitive proof from decrypted messages could not be revealed. The decision to keep the Venona Project classified for more than 50 years, it was not publicly acknowledged until 1995, has been the subject of considerable historical debate. Officials justified the secrecy on the grounds that revealing American success in breaking Soviet codes would cause the Soviets to change their encryption methods, closing off this intelligence source. The Soviets did eventually learn about Venona through their own penetrations of Western intelligence services, but American officials chose to maintain the fiction that the codes remained secure rather than confirm Soviet suspicions. Critics have argued that the secrecy prevented defendants in espionage trials from accessing evidence that might have exonerated them or from challenging the accuracy of the intelligence used against them. The families caught in this machinery bore consequences that extended across generations. Children grew up with the stigma of having a parent who was a spy, struggled with questions of identity and loyalty, faced discrimination and suspicion, and carried psychological burdens that affected their own families in turn. Spouses discovered that their marriages had been built on deception, that the person they thought they knew had been living a double life, that their entire understanding of their relationship had been false. Siblings found themselves divided by questions of loyalty and complicity, by decisions about whether to testify against family members, by the impossibility of maintaining relationships across the divide of espionage and betrayal. The psychological impact on children of accused spies has been documented by researchers studying Cold War espionage cases. Common patterns include difficulty trusting others, anxiety about their own identities and loyalties, academic and behavioral problems during childhood and adolescence, struggles with authority figures, difficulties forming stable relationships in adulthood, and transmission of trauma to subsequent generations. Many children of convicted spies reported spending decades trying to understand their parents' motivations, oscillating between anger at parents for destroying their families and sympathy for parents who they believed had acted on principle. Spouses faced different but equally difficult challenges. Many were entirely unaware of their partner's espionage activities and experienced the discovery as a complete betrayal of trust. Others had known or suspected but had chosen not to confront the issue, creating their own complicity and guilt. Some maintained their belief in their spouse's innocence despite overwhelming evidence, unable to reconcile the person they loved with the crimes they were accused of. Others divorced and attempted to rebuild their lives, carrying the stigma of having been married to a spy and questioning their own judgment in having failed to recognize what was happening. Meredith Gardner, the cryptanalyst whose breakthrough had made all of this possible, continued working on Soviet communications for decades. He retired from the National Security Agency, the successor to Arlington Hall's Signals Intelligence Operation, in 1972 at the age of 57. In interviews he gave after the Venona Project was declassified in 1995, Gardner reflected on the impact of his work with genuine ambivalence, taking professional pride in the cryptanalytic achievement while expressing awareness of the human consequences. Gardner was asked in one interview whether he felt any responsibility for what happened to the people identified through Venona. His response was thoughtful but inconclusive. He said that he had been a soldier and intelligence officer doing his job, that the work was necessary for national security, but that he had sometimes wondered about the individuals behind the cover names and case numbers. He acknowledged that compartmentalization was a kind of ethical evasion, that he had benefited professionally from work that ruined people's lives, and that there were no simple answers to the question of responsibility. He died in 2002 at the age of 87, having lived long enough to see the Venona materials declassified and to witness the historical debates about their significance. Assigning culpability in cases stemming from Venona is extraordinarily complex because it requires evaluating the choices of multiple actors operating within systems that shaped their options and understanding. The individuals who committed espionage chose to provide information to Soviet intelligence, and they bore responsibility for those choices and their consequences, but they made those choices in contexts where their political beliefs and their understanding of the geopolitical situation led them to rationalize espionage as idealistic assistance rather than as betrayal. Their Soviet handlers exploited their idealism, using ideological appeals to recruit them while concealing the fact that they were using them as intelligence assets rather than as political allies. The FBI and prosecutors pursued these individuals using evidence obtained through methods that could not be revealed, limiting defendants' ability to mount full defenses. The legal system sentenced people to prison or death for providing information that varied enormously in sensitivity and impact, from atomic secrets that genuinely compromised national security to policy memoranda that had minimal intelligence value. The decision to maintain Venona's secrecy meant that some guilty people were never prosecuted while others were prosecuted using seemingly circumstantial evidence that appeared weaker than the actual proof that existed. And throughout all of this, the families bore consequences for choices they had no part in making. They lost parents and spouses, lost their financial security, faced social stigma and ostracism, struggled with psychological trauma, and spent decades dealing with aftermath they did not deserve. They were victims with no agency, casualties of an intelligence war they did not know existed until it destroyed their lives. Evaluating whether the Venona Project was worth these human costs depends on one's perspective regarding the balance between national security and civil liberties, between the value of intelligence operations and the protection of due process, between the needs of the state and the rights of individuals. Those who emphasize national security argue that the Venona Project was essential to protecting American interests during the Cold War, that it exposed genuine threats to national security, and that the prosecutions and security measures that resulted were necessary responses to real espionage. The Soviet intelligence networks that Venona exposed had penetrated the most sensitive areas of American government and defense, had obtained atomic secrets that accelerated Soviet nuclear weapons development, and had compromised American diplomatic and military planning. Those who emphasize civil liberties argue that the secrecy surrounding Venona enabled prosecutions based on evidence that could not be challenged, that it contributed to a climate of fear and suspicion that exceeded any genuine threat, and that the human cost in destroyed lives and families was not justified by the intelligence gains. They point to cases like Ethel Rosenberg, whose involvement in her husband's espionage was minimal, but who was executed partly to pressure Julius to confess, and whose death left 2 young children orphaned based on questionable evidence that could not be fully examined because of Venona's classification. What is certain is that the mathematics of cryptanalysis, however elegant and impressive as intellectual achievement, translated directly into human consequences that extended far beyond the technical work of breaking codes. The 5-digit number groups that Meredith Gardner examined in that cramped office at Arlington Hall Station in 1943 represented messages between Soviet intelligence officers and their headquarters. But they also represented human beings making choices, taking risks, living double lives. And when those messages were decrypted, they became evidence that destroyed families, ended careers, sent people to prison, and resulted in executions. The technical achievement of the Venona cryptanalysis was remarkable by any measure. Soviet one-time pad encryption, when properly implemented, was mathematically unbreakable, and the fact that American cryptanalysts succeeded in exploiting the key reuse to decrypt thousands of messages represented exceptional skill and persistence. Gardner's work required not just mathematical ability, but linguistic intuition, patience, attention to detail, and the intellectual creativity to recognize patterns in what appeared to be random data. The project involved hundreds of cryptanalysts working over 4 decades, producing intelligence that fundamentally shaped American understanding of Soviet espionage capabilities and that influenced counterintelligence policy for generations. But the human cost of that technical achievement extended far beyond the individuals who were prosecuted and imprisoned. The Venona decryptions identified hundreds of Americans who had some relationship with Soviet intelligence, and the existence of this classified information shaped American counterintelligence operations and domestic security policies for decades. The fear of Soviet espionage, fueled by knowledge of how extensive Soviet intelligence operations had been in the 1930s and 1940s, contributed to the anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era, to the implementation of intrusive security clearance procedures, to the blacklisting of individuals suspected of communist sympathies, and to a climate of suspicion that destroyed careers and lives. The photograph that appears in histories of the Venona Project shows Meredith Gardner as a young man in military uniform seated at a desk covered with papers, looking at the camera with an expression that suggests both intelligence and weariness. The photograph was taken sometime in the mid-1940s, when Gardner was in his 20s or early 30s, when he was doing the cryptanalytic work that would lead to the identification of Soviet intelligence sources throughout the American government and defense establishment. In the photograph, Gardner looks like an ordinary young officer doing paperwork. There is nothing in the image that suggests the significance of what he is working on or the consequences that will flow from his success. That banality, the ordinariness of the image, the fact that cryptanalysis looks like office work, that breaking codes that destroy families appears in photographs as a man at a desk with papers, is perhaps the deepest truth about intelligence operations and their human cost. The work is technical, mathematical, procedural. The consequences are human, emotional, generational. And the gap between those two realities is where families lived their lives, caught between mathematics and morality, between state security and family survival, between the elegance of signals intelligence and the messiness of human suffering. Michael and Robert Rosenberg were 10 and 6 years old when the Venona decryptions led to their parents' arrest in 1950. They were 13 and 9 when their parents were executed in 1953. They spent decades believing their parents were innocent, unable to reconcile loving memories with accusations of treason. They were 68 and 64 when the Venona materials were declassified in 1995, and they finally learned the mathematical proof behind their parents' conviction, decrypted messages that definitively established Julius Rosenberg's guilt but raised new questions about whether Ethel deserved execution. And in between, they lost their childhood, their identities, their understanding of who they were, carrying burdens they did not choose across 7 decades of life. The Venona Project succeeded. It broke codes that Soviet cryptographers believed were unbreakable. It exposed espionage networks that had penetrated the highest levels of American government. It provided intelligence that shaped Cold War policy and counterintelligence operations for generations. It was a triumph of cryptanalytic skill, mathematical insight, and patient analysis, and it destroyed families, not as collateral damage, but as its direct and intended consequence, because breaking the codes meant identifying the people, and identifying the people meant arresting them, and arresting them meant prosecuting them. And prosecuting them meant imprisoning or executing them, and all of that meant destroying the families who loved them and depended on them and who had committed no crime beyond being related to people who made terrible choices during a terrible time.